So thank you very much for coming out. I know the weather has not cooperated so much in the last day, but so I'm going to talk about a few things: Python, Zork, PExpect. If you're in DevOps, I'll wake you up about 2/3 into the talk, and you'll really get a lot out of the last part. If you're into video games and kind of the history of video games, you'll like the first part. In the middle part, we're just going to do some Python, go through some code, and show you how it works. I do have to warn you, there's if you've never played Zork before, there are spoilers, and so I'll tell you to close your eyes during some part of the code review. So here it is. I'll be talking about the history of where Zork comes from, a little bit of the mechanics of how it works, how it relates to Java, and how it relates to a few other things, video games that you might see these days. We will go through what PExpect is, which is a Python library that is extremely useful and can really up your game in terms of scripting. It's like shell scripting on steroids. Then we're going to have Batman explain how the code works. You'll see in a bit. Then we'll look at the code. We'll do a live demo, and this is the exciting part where it's probably going to fail a couple times because that's what live demos do. It's the most fun. And then we'll talk about where things go from there and what else you could do with PExpect and why, even though you might not want to do Zork and do the stuff that I'm going to be demonstrating, but this just shows you extreme automation skills. If you can automate what I'm doing, you can pretty much automate anything. So here we go. So to understand Zork, we first have to go back to 1974 when Gary Gygax and I think it's Dave Arneson came out with Dungeons and Dragons. And it's something that Dungeons and Dragons took the world by storm. There's a lot of people upset about it because it would steal the souls of young children. It's something that it was a fun game. Very popular at universities, and it led to a very interesting event. And this is a picture of Will Crowther here in the corner, and that's a PDP-10. The year after Dungeons and Dragons came out, he went through a divorce. And you think, well, that's horrible, but he had all this extra time on his hands, and he had this really cool computer. And he had some young children that were totally bored when they came to visit him at work. So he wrote a program called Adventure. Yeah. So Adventure, you might know it as Advin because on the PDP-10, the operating system could only have 6-letter file names. So it was Advin. I don't know. But anyway, it's something that he wrote this Adventure program, and you type commands, and it had a 2-word parser, so you could get sword, go building. Your English wasn't very good, but it was enough to wander through this maze and cave structure that he wrote. About a year after this, a bunch of students were playing this at MIT and thought, we can do way better. At the time, the parlance at MIT for an unfinished program was a Zork. So they had this program that they were developing on a PDP-10 at MIT, and which they just said, oh, it's not finished. It's Zork. So after working on that for a couple of years, they wrote a parser that wasn't a 2-word parser, but a multi-word parser. So now you could say, put the sword in the case, or get the lamp and turn it on. You can type in commands like that and it would work. So as soon as they finished it, about 2 years later, in 1978, they called it Dungeon. And it's kind of funny, they were threatened with a lawsuit from these guys because they said, well, Dungeon's clearly trademarked, which is not really that good, but these students at MIT didn't want to fight it, so they called it Zork again. So now we have Zork. Now this is mainframe Zork. It had a lot of different puzzles, a lot of real estate, but something else started happening around 1978, which if you look at this picture, a PDP-10 is about the size of about 4 or 5 refrigerators. But in 1978, these guys started showing up that are the size of a terminal. And they said, well, wait a minute, why don't we see if we can get this Zork program running on one of these machines? Now, these things only have like 32K, but they figured out a way to get a subset of their dungeon program to work on a Trash 80, the Apple IIs, the Commodore PETs, and a lot of these other little microcomputers that started coming out. So they were able to port this mainframe program to microcomputers, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute. These are a few of the other Dungeons and Dragons derived games. It's something that you not only had Zork, but there's an Ultima, Wizardry, Rogue. These are all games that are coming around the very early 80s. So it's something that, like for example, Rogue, you can trace that to Hack, to NetHack, and eventually on to something, Dwarf Fortress, if some of you've heard that. And Dwarf Fortress, of course, inspired Minecraft. Has anyone heard of that? Minecraft? Okay. Wizardry, you wandered around a maze in a first-person perspective. You could turn, and eventually you had other games that had solid walls, and then they had solid walls with textures, and then solid walls with textures that you can move around smoothly. I think it was Castle Wolfenstein 3D, which then you got Doom and Quake, and you get it. So these games are kind of at the root of modern video games. So the way that Zork works, and this is kind of the end of the first section, which is about Zork. Let me go through here. So Zork was originally written on a mainframe language called Muddle. Does anyone, probably no one's here used, I've never used it. To get it to work on Apple IIs and Trash 80s and other tiny machines, they ended up using a trick that you've probably heard of Java, where you take your code and you compile it to a bytecode that runs on a virtual bytecode runner. That's exactly what they did. So they didn't have to port Zork to every single platform. What they did was they rewrote Zork in a language called Zil, which got compiled to Z code. And then they had a Z machine, which was a tiny little virtual Z code runner, Z code machine. And that would allow them to run this same Z code on all platforms. And it's pretty amazing because Zork 1.dat, that's the original Z code from the original game that was released in 1980. It runs on my MacBook Pro from 2014 without any modifications whatsoever, because there's Z machines available that you can get right now. So Frotz is the Z machine that I've used. There's a couple other ones. People have reverse engineered the ZIL, and you can still get all these things, the Zork data and all of this on the web. In fact, I have links to the last slide. So we have, so Frotz builds 2 targets, Frotz and defrots. Frotz uses curses. Has anyone cursed at curses? So curses is a way to do command line that has windows and lines and things around it. It's still all text, but it has text with structures that you can play around with. Defrots is just strictly line by line, so it's without the curses stuff. So let's start talking about Python and PExpect. PExpect is a library that pulls into Python almost a different language. It is, at its root, a way to spawn off external programs and then take control of their input and output. So, like for example, when you type Python without any arguments, you get an interactive shell. You might have seen that. Okay. Imagine you can have a Python program launch another instance of the Python interactive shell and both put commands on the shell as well as read out stuff and interact with it. So now you have Python making decisions about what to type, watching what happens inside that other shell, which is running in another process. And you can do multiple processes. In fact, you can do things over SSH. You can use you can use Python and PExpect to scrape things from FTP. You can use it for a lot of things. So essentially what this allows you to do is take your scripting skills and apply it to interactive programs like Zork. So now, before I explain how my program works that I'll be going through, I'm going to have Batman actually tell you how it works. So let's get Batman up here.
Who are you here to see?
I'm here to see your butt.
Is that last name Bud, first name yours? Oh my gosh!
Pow. Wham. Cut zap. First try.
If you understand that, you'll actually understand how my code works. It's crazy, but you'll see in just a few seconds here. So let's actually start looking at the code, and I'll tell you to close your eyes here in just a second because you're going to see how this works. Okay, so for those of you who think that you might want to play Zork, this is the part where you close your eyes, because this is how you win Zork. There's 227 commands here, and okay, for those of you that want to play the game, you can open your eyes again. So we have all the commands that win Zork. We also have a list of places that we're going to save the game strategically. So anytime that we want to do something dangerous, we save the game. We try to do that dangerous thing, and if we get killed, we come back and restore the game, and we try again, until every time there's something dangerous, we get it every time on the first try. See, that's where the Batman... Okay. There's about 28 different ways to die in this game. This is not all of the ways. This is just the ones that happen in strategic parts where you're wandering around, the thief shows up, and then he stabs you. Cuts your throat, knocks your sword away. These are bad things. They kill you a lot in this game. So there's a list of things that we don't want to see, and I'll explain how PExpect. You tell it, here's what I want, and you usually put the good thing at the very end, because that's the last thing it's going to try to look for. Otherwise, if you see something else on these lists, you get an index into your table as to what went wrong. So if you have a shell that you're automating, you put all the bad things first, and then the good result at the end. And then when you actually run that command, that's what it'll be looking for in that order. So you can see here my little shortcut for restoring the game. I have to give it a file name, and I'm looking for I do want to explain why is there two lines here. There's an OK, and then there's a little greater than. If you leave that greater than expected, if you don't put that in there, if you run another command and you say, look for a greater than, it might find it before that command has actually outputted things. So in order to get your program to run really solidly, you kind of have to say, am I at the end of the last command before I'm looking for additional things? How much time, are we good on time? Okay, we're good for time. Excellent here. So, we're over time. Oh man, okay. I'll go through this real quick then. So we have basically a loop that says, while I'm not finished with the game, try to run the command, try to save it, and then here's all the different exceptions. So all of this is on GitHub so that you'll have things to link. Let's run this one through and see what happens. So go. You can see it's playing the game. We already killed the troll. It's working on trying to kill the thief. It's having a hard time. Something is, usually it's killed him by then, but let's try this one more time. Of course, it always works at home and it never works here. So let's try a couple more keys here. Okay, we killed the troll.
Died.
Kill the troll, kill the thief. Gone. There it goes. Yes. Okay. I have a couple other things. You can look at the code and see where it has to try a couple things. And it's probably. There we go. So let's see here. That is the code and demo. Like I said, if you're in DevOps, PExpect is a super powerful tool. You can do a lot of things. Oh, sorry. Okay, we just won Zork. For those of you who didn't catch that in the back. So PExpect is not just for games. If you're in DevOps, if you're doing anything where you have to do advanced scripting, this is a super powerful tool. And lots of good examples on the web. Here's links. The first link is where my code is, as well as a cleaned up version of Frauds. The second one is where you can get all the Infocom games. They've been public domained. There's about 20 of them. If you want a longer history, even longer than I've been talking, there's about a 1 hour video if you look on YouTube for Zork game postmortem. One of the authors of Zork talks about all the influences, and it has a lot of interesting things in it. And then that last link is just the documentation for PExpect. So hopefully you'll add PExpect to your toolkit of things to do in Python. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, John, for the absolutely thorough presentation.